Hello, everyone. Today we are taking a deep dive into this Washington Post report. A trade war between Canada and the US further ruptures a once close and durable alliance. We are going to break down exactly what happened here and how this actually affects businesses, workers, and money on both sides of the border. But before that, you are watching Decode Daily News, where we take the biggest business and finance stories and decode them so anyone can understand. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. So let us get into it. Something broke that a lot of people assumed was unbreakable. The United States imposed 50% tariffs on about $20 billion worth of Canadian goods early Saturday. I want you to actually picture that number for a second. 50% is not a warning shot. That is a wall. That is the kind of tariff that does not just slow trade down, it makes entire categories of goods financially pointless to ship. And this did not happen after months of quiet buildup. It happened right after talks collapsed, which tells you this was sitting loaded the whole time. When a government moves that fast, it usually means the decision was already made long before the headlines caught up. And Canada did not just absorb it quietly. Carney said Canada would retaliate dollar for dollar beginning September 8th, targeting sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. Here is what most people are going to miss about that list. This is not a random basket of goods. Steel, dairy, appliances, these are things that show up in everyday household spending and in industries that employ a lot of people on both sides of the border. When a country times its retaliation to a specific date instead of reacting immediately, that is not emotion, that is strategy. Carney is giving businesses a runway to prepare, which honestly tells you this fight is expected to last longer than a few news cycles. Now here is the line that made me stop and actually read it twice. He accused the US of using economic integration as a weapon and said its signature was written in pencil. That phrase alone deserves its own conversation. Think about what written in pencil actually implies. It means agreements, trust, decades of trade cooperation. None of it was treated as permanent. It could be erased the moment it stopped being convenient. For investors and business owners who plan 5 or 10 years out, that is a genuinely unsettling idea. Because it suggests the rules of the relationship can change overnight regardless of what was signed on paper before. And there is a political layer to this that most coverage glosses over. Provincial and conservative leaders broadly backed Carney. Now that right there is not a small detail. When politicians across different provinces start agreeing on the same message at the same time, that is usually a signal the pressure is real, not staged for cameras. And it did not stop with just general support. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said the old status quo is not possible. Sit with how blunt that statement actually is. A premier saying the old status quo is not possible is not diplomatic language. That is someone publicly admitting the relationship everyone grew up with is finished. And that kind of statement does not get walked back easily. And then came a similar message from a different province entirely, while Ontario Premier Doug Ford praised Carney for rejecting what he called a bad deal for the auto, steel, and manufacturing sectors. Here is why that particular praise matters. Ontario is the heart of Canada's auto and manufacturing industry, so when its premier calls a deal bad for those exact sectors, he is speaking for the workers and factories that would have felt this first. That is not political theater. That is someone protecting his own province's backbone. And one line from a union leader made this even more personal. Lana Payne, national president of Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union, accused Trump of trying to weaken Canada's industrial base. Here is why that matters beyond the politics. This is not just a trade dispute happening in boardrooms and press conferences. It is directly tied to real jobs, real factories, and real paychecks. When a union representing that many workers frames it as an attack on the industrial base, it shifts the conversation from abstract economics into something people feel in their own communities. That is usually when public pressure on both governments intensifies, and the fallout is not staying inside boardrooms either. Canadian travel to the US remains sharply lower than before the dispute. That single line already tells you something. People do not usually change their travel habits over politics they do not personally feel. When everyday behavior shifts like this, it means the tension has moved from headlines into actual households. And the numbers behind that shift are worth hearing, with July return trips down nearly 29% by car. Pause on that number for a second. Nearly a third fewer road trips is not a rounding error. That is a massive behavioral shift happening in a single month. And road trips are usually the most casual, spontaneous kind of travel there is. And it was not just people driving less either, and 27% by air from July 2024, Statistics Canada said. This is the part that seals the pattern. When both driving and flying drop by similar amounts, that rules out a one-off explanation like gas prices or a bad travel season. This looks like a genuine, broad-based decision by Canadians to simply spend their money somewhere else. But before I go further into what this actually costs both sides, this video is for educational purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. Now let us actually look at how much economic pain is on the table right now. Royal Bank of Canada economists estimate the tariffs directly affect about 0.4% of Canada's GDP because they cover only about 5% of Canadian exports to the US. At first glance, that sounds almost manageable, and that is exactly why this number is a little dangerous. 0.4% feels small enough that people assume the whole situation is contained. But that figure only covers what is happening today. Not what happens if retaliation expands, if more industries get pulled in, or if companies start delaying investment because they are unsure what the trade relationship even looks like in a year. Small numbers in trade disputes have a habit of growing quietly before anyone notices. Here is where the story flips in a way I think a lot of people are not talking about enough. Carney said Canada supplies 99% of US natural gas imports, 85% of its electricity imports, and 60% of its crude oil imports. Sit with those percentages for a moment. This is not a one-way dependency, no matter how the headlines frame it. 99% of natural gas imports is not a small supplier relationship. That is basically the entire pipeline. If this dispute drags on, and either side decides to use energy as leverage, American households and manufacturers would feel that just as fast as Canadian exporters would feel the tariffs. Whoever assumes only one side has something to lose here has not actually looked at these numbers. And there is a business voice in all this that deserves attention too. Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, said, now, who is saying this matters as much as what he said. This is not a politician or an economist. This is the person whose entire job is representing the interests of Canadian businesses. When that voice speaks up, it usually reflects what companies are actually planning behind closed doors, not just public messaging. And what he said next is where it gets interesting. Businesses still view the US as Canada's most important trading partner. That part alone is not surprising. Nobody expected businesses to suddenly abandon their biggest customer overnight. Old relationships like this do not disappear just because of one bad year, no matter how dramatic the headlines sound. But then he added the part that actually changes the story, but increasingly see the shift as lasting beyond Trump. That is the line worth remembering. If business leaders themselves believe this outlasts one administration, that means companies are not waiting around for a quick fix. They are already adjusting long-term plans around a new, more uncertain normal, and that kind of quiet shift tends to matter more than any single tariff announcement. And Canada is not just sitting still waiting for this to resolve itself. He has traveled abroad seeking investment and new trade ties, aiming to attract 1 trillion Canadian dollars by 2030 and double non-US investment over the next decade. This is the part that tells you where the real long-term story is heading. A $1 trillion diversification target is not a reaction to one bad weekend of trade talks. It is a signal that Canada is planning for a future where it is simply less dependent on the United States altogether. If that plan actually gains traction, It slowly reshapes who Canada's biggest trading partners are for decades, not just for as long as this particular dispute lasts. That is exactly where my take comes in. So what concerns me most here is not the 50% tariff itself, it is how many people are treating this as temporary. Trade relationships that took decades to build do not usually snap back just because one administration changes. If businesses on either side start planning around the assumption that this uncertainty is permanent rather than a phase, that changes investment decisions, hiring decisions, and supply chain decisions for years. What is being underplayed in most coverage is the energy dependency angle. Everyone focuses on Canadian exports getting taxed, but almost nobody is asking what happens to US energy prices if this relationship keeps deteriorating. That risk barely gets mentioned, and I think that is a mistake. For everyday investors, the practical takeaway is simple. Any company you hold that leans heavily on cross-border manufacturing, steel, autos, or agriculture is now sitting in a genuinely uncertain environment, and uncertainty is usually what markets punish first, long before the actual damage even shows up in earnings. And honestly, the diversification move Canada is making might end up being the most important part of this entire story, even more than the tariffs themselves, because it hints at a slower, quieter shift in global trade patterns that could outlast this specific dispute entirely. If this kind of breakdown actually helped things click for you, do me a favor and hit that like button, and if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. I would genuinely like to know, do you think this Canada-US trade relationship ever goes back to how it used to be, or is this permanent? Drop your thoughts in the comments.